Welcome to Flash Bible Stories, where we dive deep into the fascinating and sometimes funny ways people have tried to help God throughout history. Have you ever heard of the saying, "The road to hell is paved with good intentions"? Well, the same can be said about the road to spiritual confusion. Often, when we misunderstand or misapply biblical teachings, we end up creating more problems than we solve. Today, we're going to explore some hilarious yet eye-opening examples from the Bible where people tried to lend a hand to the Almighty, only to end up making things more complicated. So, buckle up and pay close attention, especially to the last example. It's where many of us unknowingly go astray. Don't forget to drop your thoughts in the comments and subscribe for more insightful videos. Let's start with Sarah, the wife of Abraham. Sarah and Abraham had received a grand promise from God. Abraham would become the father of many nations, Genesis 12:2. However, as time went on, Sarah remained childless, and both of them grew older. This long wait for a child tested Sarah's patience. In Genesis 16, Sarah's frustration leads her to take a drastic step. She decides to help God by giving her maid, Hagar, to Abraham as a concubine so that Hagar could bear a child on her behalf. This was a common practice in their culture, but it was not what God had intended. Sarah hoped that through Hagar, she would finally see the fulfillment of God's promise. Hagar conceives and gives birth to a son, Ishmael, Genesis 16:3-4. However, this plan leads to a series of complications. Sarah becomes envious and bitter, leading to tension and conflict between her and Hagar. Hagar, feeling mistreated, flees into the wilderness, Genesis 16:6-7. This act of trying to help God results in personal strife and a complicated family dynamic. The problems escalated until God finally fulfills his promise to Sarah, allowing her to conceive and bear Isaac, Genesis 21:1-2. Isaac is the child through whom God's covenant would continue. This story teaches us that when we try to force God's promises or act out of impatience, we often end up creating more problems than solutions. God's timing is perfect, and it's crucial to trust in it. Our next story involves Abraham, who faced a tricky situation twice. During times of danger, Abraham resorts to deception to protect himself. In Genesis 12:10-20, during a famine, Abraham and Sarah go to Egypt. Fearing that the Egyptians would kill him to take Sarah, Abraham tells Pharaoh that Sarah is his sister, not his wife. Pharaoh takes Sarah into his palace, but God intervenes by sending plagues upon Pharaoh and his household. Pharaoh realizes the truth and confronts Abraham, who then explains his deception, Genesis 12:17-19. Abraham's deception causes a great deal of trouble, not just for himself, but for Pharaoh as well. The second instance occurs in Genesis 20, where Abraham repeats this deception with Abimelech, king of Gerar. Again, Sarah is taken into Abimelech's household, and once more, God intervenes by warning Abimelech in a dream. Abimelech confronts Abraham, and God's promise is preserved despite Abraham's lapse in trust. These episodes highlight that even those who are deeply faithful can make mistakes. Abraham's attempt to protect himself through deception shows a lack of complete trust in God's protection. Despite his faith, Abraham's actions reveal a tendency to rely on human schemes rather than fully trusting in God's provision. Next, we turn to Uzzah, a man who faced a tragic fate while trying to help in a moment of crisis. The Ark of the Covenant, a sacred symbol of God's presence among his people, was being transported to Jerusalem. The ark was supposed to be carried by the Levites on their shoulders, Exodus 25:14, but it was placed on a cart pulled by oxen, 2 Samuel 6:3. During the procession, the oxen stumble and the ark begins to topple. Uzzah reaches out to steady it, touching the ark in the process, 2 Samuel 6:6. Although Uzzah's intentions were good, he wanted to prevent the ark from falling. His action was a grave mistake. According to the law, only the priests were allowed to handle the ark, and even then, it had to be carried with great care and respect. As a result of his irreverence, Uzzah is struck dead by God, 2 Samuel 6:7. This event deeply troubles King David, who initially reacts with fear and anger. The ark is temporarily left at the house of Obed-Edom, where it remains for 3 months, and during this time, Obed-Edom's household is blessed, 2 Samuel 6:10-11. The story of Uzzah underscores the importance of adhering to God's commands. Even well-intentioned actions can have severe consequences if they disregard God's specific instructions. It serves as a stark reminder of the sanctity of God's commands and the need for reverence and obedience. Our next story takes us to King Saul, who had a significant lapse in judgment. In 1 Samuel 13, Saul is preparing for battle against the Philistines. Samuel, the prophet, had instructed Saul to wait for him to offer a burnt sacrifice before going into battle. 1 Samuel 10:8. However, as the days pass and Samuel does not arrive, Saul's army becomes restless. Fearing that his troops will scatter and the battle will be lost, Saul decides to perform the sacrifice himself. 1 Samuel 13:9-10. This act of impatience and presumption is a serious breach of divine order, as only Samuel the prophet had the authority to offer such sacrifices. As soon as Saul finishes the offering, Samuel arrives and confronts him. Samuel informs Saul that his kingdom will not last because of his disobedience. 1 Samuel 13:13-14. Saul's attempt to help by taking on the role of the prophet undermines his position and reveals a lack of trust in God's timing and instructions. This story teaches us that God's commands are not to be taken lightly, and attempting to bypass or rush divine procedures can lead to dire consequences. It's essential to respect and adhere to God's appointed roles and times. In the New Testament, we encounter Peter's moment of impulsive action. During the arrest of Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane, Peter draws his sword and strikes the servant of the high priest, cutting off his ear, John 18:10. Peter's intention is to defend Jesus from the arrest, but this act of violence is contrary to Jesus' purpose and mission. Jesus responds by rebuking Peter and healing the servant's ear, Luke 22:51. Jesus explains that his mission involves suffering and submission, not violent resistance. By reacting with violence, Peter demonstrates a misunderstanding of Jesus' mission and the nature of the kingdom he is establishing. This incident illustrates that even with the best intentions, acting outside of God's will and plan can lead to misunderstandings and unnecessary conflict. Jesus' response underscores the importance of aligning our actions with God's broader purposes, rather than relying on our own interpretations of how to help him. Let's turn to Jacob, who used deceit to achieve his goals. In Genesis 27, Jacob, with his mother Rebekah's encouragement, deceives his blind father Isaac into giving him the blessing meant for his elder brother, Esau. Jacob dresses in goatskins to mimic Esau's hairy arms and prepares a meal to fool his father. Genesis 27:15-17. Jacob's deceit results in Isaac giving him the blessing of the firstborn, which was intended for Esau. When Esau discovers the trickery, he is furious and threatens Jacob, leading to conflict and estrangement between the brothers. Genesis 27:41. This deception causes significant turmoil and sets in motion a series of events that affect Jacob's entire family. The story reveals the consequences of using deception to achieve one's aims. Jacob's attempt to help or secure his future through trickery results in personal and familial strife. It highlights the importance of integrity and the pitfalls of trying to manipulate situations to one's advantage, rather than trusting in God's plan and timing. Next, we examine Moses, who faced a significant challenge in the wilderness. In Numbers 20, the Israelites, grumbling about their lack of water, demand that Moses provide them with a miracle. God instructs Moses to speak to a rock to bring forth water. Numbers 28. However, in his frustration with the people, Moses strikes the rock twice with his staff instead of speaking to it as commanded. Numbers 20:11. Although water does flow from the rock, Moses' disobedience has serious consequences. God tells Moses that because he did not trust him enough to honor him as holy in the sight of the Israelites, he will not lead the people into the promised land. Numbers 20:12. This episode illustrates the critical importance of following God's instructions precisely. Even leaders like Moses are not exempt from the need for obedience and respect for divine commands. Moses' attempt to help by using an old method rather than following God's new directive leads to a significant consequence: exclusion from the fulfillment of the promise. Lastly, we explore Aaron's role in the creation of the golden calf. While Moses is on Mount Sinai receiving the 10 Commandments, the Israelites become impatient and demand an idol to worship. Aaron, under pressure from the people, collects their gold jewelry and fashions a golden calf. Exodus 32:1-4. The people declare that this calf is their God who brought them out of Egypt, and they begin to worship it with feasting and revelry. Exodus 32:5-6. When Moses returns and sees the idolatry, he is enraged. He destroys the calf and rebukes Aaron, who tries to excuse his actions by claiming the calf just came out of the fire. Exodus 32:24. The result is a devastating plague and a serious reaffirmation of the need to adhere strictly to God's commands regarding worship. Aaron's actions reveal the danger of compromising on God's commandments to appease others or to manage difficult situations. This incident emphasizes the importance of staying true to God's instructions and resisting the temptation to conform to popular demands at the expense of divine law. Our final story takes us to the Tower of Babel. After the flood, humanity, united by a single language, decides to build a city and a tower that reaches to the heavens, hoping to make a name for themselves and prevent their dispersion across the earth. Genesis 11:1-4. In their pride and ambition, they seek to defy God's command to fill the earth and spread out. God observes their project and decides to intervene. He confuses their language, causing them to no longer understand each other. Genesis 11:7. The people are scattered across the earth, and the tower remains unfinished. Genesis 11:8-9. The Tower of Babel story illustrates the futility of human pride and the consequences of attempting to thwart God's plans. The desire to make a name for themselves and avoid God's command leads to confusion and division. This episode highlights the importance of humility and the recognition that God's plans will prevail despite human attempts to alter or obstruct them. And there you have it, some of the Bible's most fascinating stories where people tried to help God in their own ways. From Sarah's impatient scheme and Abraham's deception to Uzzah's tragic touch and Aaron's golden calf, each story provides valuable lessons about the importance of following God's commands and trusting in His timing. The final story, the Tower of Babel, serves as a powerful reminder of the limits of human pride and the inevitability of God's plans. Understanding these episodes helps us avoid repeating the same mistakes and encourages us to trust in God's wisdom and timing. Thank you for joining us on this enlightening journey. Share your thoughts in the comments and don't forget to subscribe to Flash Bible Stories for more engaging and insightful content. Until next time, stay blessed.